Merry Christmas.
Because it's still Christmas. You know the song, The 12 Days of Christmas? Well, there really are 12, which is probably good because God coming to earth to be with us is probably a bigger deal than just a one-day celebration. So Christmas starts on the 25th of December, but it goes all the way to January 6th. So nobody is allowed to have post-holiday letdown yet. Right? But seriously, now that the distraction of the presents and the preparing and the making food and the eating the junk food is over, we can actually celebrate a little more, right? Because Isaiah definitely did in the passage that we read today, that Don read for us. Thank you. In the first verse in chapter 61, verse 10, he says, "I will rejoice greatly in the Lord. My whole being shall exult in my God." So let's start with a definition. What in the world does exult mean? Really, does anybody know what exult means? I had to look it up. And somewhere on the internet tells me that it means to show or feel elation or jubilation, especially as the result of a success. So have you ever seen anyone exulting? What kinds of things do people exult over? I don't know about you, but even when I'm passionate about something, sometimes people have a little bit of a hard time telling that I am. A couple people have said, "So, are you excited about graduating from seminary in May?" And I say, "Yeah, I'm really excited." And I'm really excited, but I'm not exulting with my whole being. You can't necessarily tell that that is excitement. And I think that whole self exaltation in humans is a little tough to come by. I think most of us are usually a little too cynical for that. We can be fans of stuff. We might get emotionally involved with an idea or a cause. We can even rant or rejoice on Facebook if something really tugs at our heartstrings or drives us crazy. But I'm not sure how often we exult with our whole beings. And I think if we're honest, even if we do, most of us have a hard time imagining getting that excited about God. And that is, of course, who Isaiah is excited about. So since most of us, I think, or maybe just me, can't really picture ourselves getting that excited about God, then let's try this analogy. As you probably know, Paul and I have 2 dogs, Shemp and Oscar. If either one of us goes away somewhere, when we come back, they are so excited, they cannot get over the fact that we're home. They smile, you know how dogs smile, they bounce, they wiggle. It's all they can do not to jump up at us and knock us over. They get that happy even if we're gone for like 5 minutes and then we come back. They are so excited that we're there. Dogs know who they belong to. And when they see that person, if they have a good relationship with that person, their whole being exults in that person. And I really think that that is the kind of exaltation Isaiah is talking about. But why? Why is he so happy and excited? Let's look at the rest of the initial verse. He says, "God has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with a garland, and as a bride adorns herself with jewels." So now we have to talk context a little bit. First, I need to let you know that there's some disagreement about who actually wrote the book of Isaiah, and whether it was 1 guy, 2 guys, 3 guys, 11 guys. There's kind of any possible number. It's a pretty long book, and it covers a pretty broad span of Jewish history, and so that's where some of the disagreement comes in. I want to acknowledge this. I will even acknowledge that I have an opinion about it, but we're not going to get into that right now. I think for our purposes, it's just simpler to say Isaiah, whoever it was, because he or they isn't really the point. The point is his message about God to a suffering and discouraged people. Back in the fall, we were talking about Moses and how he led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. After that deliverance, they lived in the land that God brought them to for a good long time, but there was a problem. I guess maybe the Hebrew people couldn't figure out how to exalt in the God who saved them, and so they kept worshiping all the idols, all the false gods of the people surrounding them. This was actually really hurtful, both to the people and to God. And so in many of the prophetic books of the Old Testament, the people are portrayed as a cheating spouse. They were cheating on God. They had a covenant relationship with God, like a marriage is a covenant relationship, and they had broken it. And they kept breaking it over and over. And so the pain of that dynamic runs through a large part of the Old Testament and is shown to be the reason why God allowed his people to be taken into exile. They were taken captive by other nations and dispersed, and they pretty much lost their national identity to some degree. So the beginning of the book of Isaiah talks about this too. Talks about the pending exile. The exile is about to happen. But the second half talks about hope. There's a theme of restoration and healing and joy that's supposed to come after. So this is why Isaiah is excited. The exile, the abandonment, the loss of identity is not the end of the story. God is going to wipe out the people's unfaithfulness and clothe them, and I think clothe them collectively and individually, because Isaiah talks about himself. He says it in the first person. He says, God has clothed me. He's going to clothe them with salvation and with righteousness. God is going to give the people goodness. God is going to save them. This is momentous. It is, Isaiah says, like a bride and a bridegroom getting all dressed up for their wedding, which is pretty interesting imagery if you think about it, given the whole cheating spouse concept. God is bringing them back into relationship with himself. This is awesome. Like a bride and a bridegroom who can't wait to be together, this is something to get happy about. So, maybe now we can see why Isaiah is so stoked. He and his people have a future, except the Hebrews were restored to their land, but they remained captive to other empires for generations. So, we have a couple options of how to look at this. Either Isaiah didn't know what he was talking about, or God's promises are pretty thin, or Isaiah was talking about something more than just the restoration of the Jewish people to their land. I think it's the third option. I think Isaiah was talking about the Hebrew people, and there are other parts of the Bible that tell us that God will do more, not less, than we can imagine. So I believe that too. So I guess I'm left with the third option, that though Isaiah was talking about the Old Testament Hebrews, he was also describing something more. And I think that something more has to do with Christmas and with us. But what? Well, first of all, this passage is not a feel-good Old Testament Facebook meme that people just send and don't really have to think about. It's a prophecy. And I believe that biblical prophecies have, well, either they have multiple fulfillments or it's one big long fulfillment, kind of like a time-release capsule that just sort of lets more and more fulfillment into human history. However you want to look at it, when Isaiah was dancing about God restoring the people, God really did allow them to return to their land. But about 400 years after that, more of this promise got fulfilled because Jesus showed up. This hope in this passage is the hope that we have at Christmas. During these 12 days of Christmas especially, we are celebrating that God personally and physically entered our world, ultimately to deal with our own unrighteousness or sin, to clothe us with the garments of salvation and cover us with the robe of righteousness. It's pretty impossible to miss all the bad news that has been going on in our country and around the world over the last few months. All of that bad news has its root in the utterly divisive nature of human sin. In confirmation class, the teenagers and I have been discussing how sin separates us from God, from each other, from creation, and from ourselves. And we're all infected. We can't heal ourselves. We need someone to save us from sometimes ourselves, to be honest. I had a couple of interactions this week, and I mean more than one, where I could not get out of my own way. The more I tried to clean it up, the worse it got, and the greater the separation between me and other people grew. I don't know if you ever feel like that, but that tendency, as well as much darker tendencies, are part of the human condition. It's pretty universal. The great news of this passage is that in Christ, at Christmas, God kicked off the greatest reconciliation project ever. We can exult in God because he came here in person, personally to save us and dress us up in goodness, that is righteousness, like we're going to a wedding. But of course, we still sin. We still encounter sin in other people. As I said, this very week, I and some of you had to deal with my own sin. And it's not like this is a freak occurrence. I hate to tell you, I really hate to tell you, I sin a lot. And the amount of violence that has occurred in our nation and around the world in this year alone indicates that God's grand reconciliation has not been completed. So, we can get depressed and have another cup of eggnog, or we can listen to Isaiah and believe and hope for yet a further fulfillment of this passage. Theologians often call this concept a really non-theologian-y sounding term, which is now and not yet. God has come to us and has begun the process of dressing us up in his goodness, but the process isn't complete. We are still being healed and still being reconciled to God, to each other, to creation, and to ourselves. But we are, and we will be. I personally believe Jesus is going to physically come back to earth again, and that is when this prophecy and all the others will be completely fulfilled. In the meantime, though, while we live in the now and the not yet, I honestly feel this passage has an application specifically for our church, for Greendale People's Church. In fact, I kind of got the chills the first time I read it in preparation for this sermon, because it felt really personal. Our church has been through a lot over the last few years, or even maybe decades. I've been here for part of it. Some of you have been here a lot longer. I suspect any number of us has wondered at any given point in time where God is, whether God cares about our congregation or about Greendale or about Worcester, whether what we're doing here really matters to God as much as it matters to us. Chapter 61, verse 11 especially reminded me of us. For as the earth brings forth its shoots, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all the nations. It reminds me of us because I feel like our church has been through this really long, hard winter, but I'm beginning to see signs of spring, signs of shoots beginning to spring up. Are you? This verse reminded me of the ancient carol we sang this morning, Lo, How a Rose Ere Blooming. It's a song about Isaiah's prophecies. Jesus is the rose in the song. Jesus is the first sign of spring. So, has anyone here read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis? A couple of you. Good. If you haven't, you should. I love the Narnia stories because I feel like Lewis takes these big, huge God concepts and translates them into a really good story that even kids can understand. And yet you don't even realize that you're getting theology. You're just reading a story. It's great. And there's a part of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe which kind of makes me feel like C.S. Lewis took this Isaiah passage and made a story out of it. If you know the book, you will remember that Narnia, the magical land of talking animals, has been taken over by the White Witch. She's an evil enchantress, and she makes it always winter but never Christmas. Which, man, they have winters like this. That doesn't sound fun at all. The Narnians are oppressed and fearful and mistrustful, and the White Witch has turned many of them into stone statues. So she's taken away the power of potential, of action, and even of an individual's active identity. But finally, after a winter so long, the Narnians don't even remember anything else, there is a glimmer of hope. Aslan is on the move, Mr. Beaver tells the 4 children from our world who end up in Narnia. Aslan is a mysterious lion, powerful, the true ruler of Narnia. He's been away, but rumor has it that he's coming back. And what is the first sign that these rumors are true? Christmas. After years and years of dreary winter, but never rich and warm and joyful Christmas, Father Christmas, or Santa Claus, escapes the White Witch's spell and shows up in Narnia with gifts. There's celebration, there's merriment, everybody's happy. The witch isn't defeated yet, but she will be. Her powers are weakening. This is what Christmas signifies to us. Jesus is on the move. Sin and evil and oppression aren't gone from our world yet, but every year, Christmas is a sign that one day they will be. Their powers are weakening. And after Christmas comes spring. In the Narnia story, the White Witch has deceived and captured Edmund, one of the 4 children from our world, and she and her dwarf servant are traveling with him to try to intercept the other 3. Edmund is tied up with a rope, and he's still under the power of the witch at this point in the story, but things are suddenly not going so well for her. Aslan is on the move. So I'm going to read part of the story. If it helps you to picture it, to close your eyes, you can nod off, but every moment the patches of green grew bigger and the patches of snow grew smaller. Then the mist turned from white to gold and presently cleared away altogether. Shafts of delicious sunlight struck down onto the forest floor, and overhead you could see a blue sky between the treetops. The noise of water grew louder. Presently they actually crossed a stream. Beyond it they found snowdrops growing. "Mind your own business," said the dwarf when he saw that Edmund had turned his head to look at them, and he gave the rope a vicious jerk. But, of course, this didn't prevent Edmund from seeing. Only 5 minutes later he noticed a dozen crocuses growing around the foot of an old tree. Then came a sound even more delicious than the sound of the water. Close beside the path they were following, a bird suddenly chirped from the branch of a tree. It was answered by the chuckle of another bird a little further off. And then, as if that had been a signal, there was chattering and chirping in every direction, and then a moment of full sun, and within 5 minutes the whole wood was ringing with birds' music. And wherever Edmund's eyes turned, he saw birds alighting on branches, or sailing overhead, or chasing one another, or having little quarrels, or tidying up their feathers with their beaks. Hint, they were exulting with their whole beings. "Faster, faster," said the witch. There was no trace of the fog now. The sky became bluer and bluer, and now there were white clouds hurrying across it from time to time. In the wide glades there were primroses. The trees began to come fully alive. The larches and birches were covered with green, the laburnums with gold. Soon the beech trees had put forth their delicate, transparent leaves. "This is no thaw," said the dwarf, suddenly stopping. "This is spring. What are we to do? Your winter has been destroyed, I tell you. This is Aslan's doing." Does this sound at all like Isaiah 61:11 to you? Does it sound like Greendale People's Church? I think it could be. I believe Aslan, or Jesus, is on the move no matter what. We can fight him to the bitter end like the White Witch. We might even be able to remain stone statues in the White Witch's court. Or, when Aslan breathes on us like he does to the animals in the book, we can come to life, exult in him, and joyously follow after him. Spring is exultant, but it can also be chaotic and messy. Regeneration and new life at Greendale People's Church probably will be too. Aslan, as the children are told in another part of the book, is not a tame lion. Jesus is not a tame God. We can't control him, but we can exult in him with our whole being. We can look for him and see what he is doing, even when the voices of oppression in us and around us tell us to mind our own business. We can make space for Jesus to work by his Spirit in our community and to do his work of reconciliation through us. We can pray that this will happen. Isaiah prayed for it to happen for his people, even though he also predicted that it would happen. For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. I pray this too. I pray that God will shine through us and reconcile us to each other. We can pray that God will reconcile our community and beyond to himself as he shines our salvation like a burning torch through us. Let us pursue our new name, our true identity in Christ. Let's exult in God with everything we are. Spring is coming, everybody. Aslan is on the move. Jesus is on the move. Merry Christmas. We'll sing hymn